Welcome to Cloudy with a Chance of Podcast, a show all about weather and science. I'm Storm Center 7 Chief Meteorologist McCall Vrydaghs.
And I'm Meteorologist Kirstie Zontini. We're two broadcast meteorologists in Dayton, Ohio, and we can't stop talking about weather. So when we're not on TV, we figured why not jump behind the microphone and talk about it some more.
Each episode, we talk to experts and other fun guests to learn more about the atmosphere, space, and our changing climate. Thanks for stopping by.
And we hope you enjoy the show. Thanks so much for joining us again on Cloudy with a Chance of Podcast. We're so excited to bring you episode 2 of our new season.
I know, and this episode is really interesting. We got to talk to this amazing guest that really gave us an insight to not only climate change as a whole, but specifically about heavy rainfall events.
Yes. So Bernadette Placky works for Climate Central, and that's a wonderful organization that provides data for anybody. It's open to the public to get this knowledge, but also media partners like McCall and I. So they kind of help to crunch some of the numbers and find some trends in what's happening with our changing climate. So as McCall mentioned, we focused a lot on heavy rain events.
Yes.
But she also did a lot of big picture talk, and we kind of ended on, I think, a positive note of what we can do to help change, and, that it's not anybody's fault in particular. It was, I think, a really good talk.
I do too. And I want to also hit on what you're saying there about ending positively. I think climate change is something that seems really big and scary to a lot of people. But I think that if we recognize what's happening now and the patterns that we're seeing, we can change the outcome. And there is a glimmer of hope there at the end of the tunnel. So I'm really excited for you guys to listen to episode 2. We're going to get right into it. Welcome to another episode of Cloudy with a Chance of Podcast. I'm meteorologist McCall Vrydaghs.
And I'm meteorologist Kirstie Zontini. We are in episode 2, McCall, of our series on climate change. And we have a fantastic guest this week.
Yes, we do. Last week, we were talking about snow in the Sierra Mountains and how that impacts climate change. But we really thought that we needed to bring an expert about climate change across the country.
Yes.
And we'll talk nationally, but we're also going to talk locally and really how they're intertwined. So I'm very excited for our guest today. You want to give us a little introduction?
I do. So you're already looking at Bernadette Placky, and she is an Emmy Award-winning meteorologist, and she's the director at Climate Central's Climate Matters. And you've seen McCall and I on air. We use Climate Central data and graphics a ton. So this is a fantastic resource. But Climate Matters is a program that offers data analysis, graphics, as well as other reporting resources to people like us, journalists and other on-air meteorologists, so we can kind of help explain the story of what's going on with our changing climate. So Bernadette worked as a decade, actually, as an on-air meteorologist as well. She's been in Arkansas. She's worked in Kentucky, which is very close to us, as well as Maryland. She went to Penn State, which is obviously fantastic for meteorology. And she also has the AMS seal of approval, and she's a certified broadcast meteorologist as well. She serves on a ton of boards. McCall, you're on an AMS council, but so is she, as well as a former Penn State graduate Earth and Mineral Sciences board member. She's on the Weather Channel Climate Pattern Committee, which is really cool. And she's also pretty active in her community. So we're lucky we were able to snag her. She's a pretty busy lady. Welcome, Bernadette.
Excited. Well, that was super kind. What an introduction. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So tell us a little bit about how you got to Climate Central.
Yeah, so my story, I think similar to yours with weather, is it was always a passion. It wasn't always a career path for me, quite honestly. When I was younger, my focus was gymnastics, but then getting into college, really applying that to what are my interests, what are my passions, and weather always was one. So quickly became my career path when I was at Penn State. And then from there, I graduated, worked at AccuWeather for a couple of years, forecasting, and then made the change to television, really for some of your similar reasons too, trying to keep people safe and prepared and having that direct conversation with the audience and the public when we know big storms are coming and what that can do. So then after about 10 or so years, this opportunity presented itself at Climate Central, and I really liked what they were doing. And it really follows that theme and extends on it of keeping people safe and prepared, but on much bigger levels, much bigger scales with what we're seeing with climate change. So that's what really took me to Climate Central.
I love it. And for people who might not be familiar with Climate Central, like we said, we've been using Climate Central data and graphics on air. But what is Climate Central? If somebody's like, what is that logo that they're
Yeah, who
what
are
is
those
this? Who are
people?
these people?
Yeah, exactly. So Climate Central is a nonprofit. We're a non-government organization, and we're non-advocacy also. We're policy neutral. So we really focus on the science and the communication. And Climate Central was started in 2008 when we understood what climate change was already doing, but there was this huge gap in public understanding of that science. So we were created by a really interesting group who's still on our board to really be that gap. We do research, and we do research in a way that's applicable to what we're experiencing on a regular basis. And we try to take this global issue and we try to break it down to a local level. So we know there are global connections with climate change. There are global interactions, global driving forces, but you feel it locally and you respond locally. And so that's what we try to do with our research and our communication here.
I love it.
I do too. And you guys really in the last couple of years have exploded into like the broadcast media realm. Like you said, you started in 2008, but I feel like it's in the past 3 years that we have seen you on so many TV screens. How did that evolve?
It goes way back before that too. So things take time, right? So what happened was this program, Climate Matters. So Climate Matters, Climate Central has several different projects and programs, and one of them being Climate Matters. And that's the one we really focus our media work with meteorologists. And then eventually we brought journalists into the mix. And it started with one TV meteorologist in Columbia, South Carolina, a National Science Foundation grant, and a collection of people around this project to see if we brought climate change into his broadcasts, would people learn? Would they be interested? And there was a lot of testing done pre and post, and it showed that people were interested and learned. And so there's this big group, the AMS, American Meteorological Society, NASA, NOAA, Yale, but our other real core partner over time through this entire project has been George Mason University, their Center for Climate Communication. So that was over 10 years ago. When that project was done, Climate Central went out and made this a full-time program just about 10 years ago. And when we were starting then, it was instead of this set of say 10 or 12 over the course of a year with one specific market, how do we make this a regular form of communication across the entire country? So when we started 10 years ago, there was a handful of about 10 to 12 meteorologists who signed on to want to be part of this. And so, I mean, it's free to the meteorologists, but it was really that partnership that we would produce content, they would engage in the content and slowly bring it into their work. And so over time, I really like to look at this as a framework of 3 buckets. There's the education piece. There's been a lot of that over the years. It's from going to key conferences, hosting short courses and workshops and webinars, especially during the COVID time, to the second bucket being content. And we regularly produce this weekly package of reporting resources on timely climate topics. We try to localize that to communities across the US. And the third is support. We've got a range of TV meteorologists and a range of journalists and media in general trying to take on big projects and ideas. And they have questions, whether it's, did I get this science right? Or I don't know how to answer this question. Or can you help me find a Spanish speaking expert in drought in Texas? Right. There's just a lot of different projects that people are getting into. So that's support and networking there too. So it's through those 3 categories, we've been able to build out this program. And as you said, it took a while. Change takes time. And so the first couple of years, it was a little bit slower, but over time, we were able to really grow. And what we mean by grow is it's growing the messages, growing the connections of what people are experiencing so that the public can understand how climate change is affecting them where they live.
And I really think that that is obviously an amazing goal. And like you said, it's science-based. So it's not involved in policy. It's truly looking at the statistics of a couple decades or more, and being able to apply that locally. So for us, sometimes we'll show graphics talking about how our overnight lows have warmed over the, several decades. And that's impactful to us, that how many 90-degree days, how have we seen that change in the Miami Valley? And those are just numbers. Like you can't, there's no argument. Like this is the statistics and this is where we're at now. So I do think that that's really interesting. And that's been one way we've incorporated it in our broadcast have been, if we're in dealing with a lot of heat one summer, we'll use some of the Climate Central data and look back and see how has the frequency changed. So we really obviously appreciate the work. I think
and that's why we appreciate the partnership too. It really is a partnership. And we look at it that way because as we've learned and studied in the climate change space, the public knows something's going on. They have a lot of questions and they just want to know. And in those questions, this ability to make those connections in the moment is so critical to help them understand what's going on. And then they can make more informed decisions going forward.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think what you guys do really well and why there is that marriage between you and the broadcast media group is that there's context. So you're not just a platform that's just spewing data. You're telling me why this data is important. And I think that allows us to tell that story locally. And you guys do really break it down to cities,
right? Dayton
states,
specifically,
regions. And it's so helpful for us to do our job and allow us to explain what is happening with the climate. I do want to ask though, because this is a question that's posed to us, where's the data coming from that allows you to create these graphics and the context?
And that's a great question. And so it's a range of sources. We do a lot with NOAA and NASA and government sources, EPA. I mean, they have amazing data that's accessible out there to everyone. And we use it a lot. When we take on certain topics, there may not be an open source data set for it, but we'll partner with individual scientists or we'll do the research to find the research that's out there. We'll contact them, we'll ask to use it and everything we do. And so for the public who, you guys can get this information too if you're interested. I mean, we create it for our partners, but anyone's who's willing to and wants to can access this. And you'll see when we package it together, we always put the methodology. We always put where the data came from and how we computed that data, how we analyzed it, what criteria we used of where we drop data, where we don't drop data. We try to put all of that in there.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful resource to have. And to be honest, in the broadcast world, we only have a certain amount of time to put together a forecast. And, we could set ourselves some long range products, but it's nice to have access to what your scientists are doing, which is literally looking back at, let's say, historical data from the Dayton International Airport. And then maybe they can incorporate what years were not great or whatever. And it gives us that ability, which we could crunch the numbers too, but it would take us a lot longer. And we might not be able to get it as fast or as relatable to a weather event that we have. It just takes a lot longer. So it's really great that you guys have this program where you're doing that kind of for us.
Yes, it's very topical in that moment. So typically when we want to do that special breakout, it's because it's topical.
Yeah.
And we don't have the time to do that research.
Right.
I mean, some topics include flooding.
Yes.
Right. So I know you had some particular questions about flooding.
I do. So I feel like that has definitely been, well, just the increase in moisture in general. So we talk about this a lot locally that in the Miami Valley in particular, we're not as obvious to the changing climate as, let's say, like living on the coast and watching the shoreline erode, or living in a drought-stricken area where you've got drought feeding drought and then wildfire season is extending. But what we do see is severe weather here and the frequency and intensity of it, and then also heavy rain events. And it doesn't have to be crazy flash flooding here, but just the fact that, our frequency of large scale rain events has been increasing. So can you add some context to that for us? Because we do think that's probably one of our local impacts has been flooding for us.
It absolutely is. I mean, you're dead on. Air spot on, I should say. It's you got to think of it bigger, and it's hard sometimes where you live, you get consumed in your world, but the globe is mainly water, right? And so when you heat up the globe, it's evaporating more water into the atmosphere. So when we do have these events that trigger some sort of rainfall, they're coming in bigger buckets. And rain is good in some cases, but we have limits, and our infrastructure is set up to a specific climate that we've been used to. And as that climate is changing, our infrastructure, one, is aging, but two, it's also not looking ahead. And we're seeing these changes in increased rainfall events that are only going to keep growing. So we have to be smart about how we engineer and create the infrastructure around things, even in our natural habitats too, and how we use those and utilize those in the best ways to absorb rain and direct it in the right ways.
Yeah, natural. I mean, that I was actually thinking. So an obvious way is like the different home standards for areas that are usually hit with hurricanes. Like McCall and I have had guests on before that have talked about the fact that, now the building standards for being able to sustain stronger winds is just commonplace.
Yes.
But obviously the homes built before that are not up to the same level. So I guess, is there any other context that you could add? We're not a hurricane area, but like you said, like, is it natural? Like, who would be helping with that? Is it policymakers? Is it, building homes nowadays in Ohio that you kind of have to be ready to have flooding in your basement? I don't know. Is there anything you can kind of like build a little more context for the Midwest?
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole host of people. I mean, it's our emergency managers that help us prepare for it and are always looking ahead. It is our policymakers who then can set standards. I mean, the standards that were set in some of these hurricane prone areas didn't happen by chance. They were put into policy, and that's why people had to follow them. Because sometimes change is hard. I mean, it's just hard for people in general when you're used to one thing. Same thing with building makers too, and construction. And so it's that education, and it's also the research. And there are some great places, both institutional when it comes to universities, but also private, that are doing a lot of work of testing these different codes and what works and what doesn't. And so it's the whole spectrum working together, really, from doing the research, applying the research, putting it into policies and implementation, and then preparing for it too. And so it is that whole range that we really need.
So rainfall intensity, for me, from the content that I've seen coming out from Climate Central and Climate Matters, seems to be like a sleeper change.
Yeah.
I feel like that's something that you think climate change, it's a slow process. But for me, rainfall intensity feels, as you mentioned, exponentially increasing at like a very quick pace. Are there any regions in the country that seem that they could be problematic? Because if they don't realize that this is happening, that it's going to be a big mess in just a few decades from now.
Right.
Well, like you're saying, it actually already is in many places. We've seen some massive events that are overwhelming our systems just this past summer. St. Louis, Eastern Kentucky. I mean, these kinds of big scale events would happen every so often. I mean, they always happened, right? So it's not that we didn't have big weather events before, but they're happening more. And they're pushing to new levels. And that's really overwhelming our systems too, not just the infrastructure that we talked about, but our response systems and our ability to respond. Because when you have it happen, and then again the next year, and the next year, and the next year, it's really wearing down our systems. It's wearing down people, and it's compounding. And so this is a big sleeper, as you're saying, in some places, but in some cases, it's already really obvious. When you look at the United States, overall, what we're seeing, and this is where the water part of it gets really kind of confusing, I think sometimes. Heat's obvious. You add heat to the globe, you get more heat.
Right.
But when you add that heat, think of a boiling pot of water, right? So it does more of that evaporation. The thing is, though, just because there's more water in the atmosphere doesn't mean it's always coming down. And so that's what we're seeing sometimes out west in some of these drier areas. Naturally, their natural climate is to be drier. But even in some of those areas, when we get these events, they're coming in a bigger bucket. So it's overwhelming systems in different ways because the land will get so dry and it doesn't absorb the water the same way. And then when it comes down, it's coming down in flooding events.
Right.
And so even in the drier areas, it's becoming an issue, or it is an issue. The biggest areas where we're seeing increases in rainfall in the United States are the Northeast and the Midwest. And so that includes Ohio.
Yeah.
It is a big issue. And where we've seen these crazy changes too is that it can be big swings, right? When you get it in these bigger distributions, if you get it, all of a sudden you've got a couple of inches, but if you don't get it, that's zero. So
Right.
these huge swings are really hard to plan for. And that's another thing we're seeing in Ohio.
Yeah, that's true. And obviously planning is so big. Planning was actually something that we had talked with our Dr. Schwartz about was, with snow melt and then how much snow do they have on the mountains? And then that melt then helps the cities plan for how much water they're going to be able to use to fight their wildfires. So the connectivity, I feel like, is such a thing with climate, with our changing climate, that I think maybe gets overlooked. But everything is connected.
Yes,
and
it
what
is.
happens out west, the weather pattern that they have fluctuates into ours. And if there's a hurricane, we can get impacted by the remnants. You know what I mean? I feel like we see
Exactly.
that with just hurricane season exploding, and then the states inland that are impacted too.
And severe weather season. I've seen
Yes.
some data where it's, perhaps if you look through the spring season, you would more likely see tornadoes stretched out throughout the season, where now there's these big gaps in time, and then you have these huge outbreaks.
Right.
So it's definitely shifting where tornadoes are occurring as well. Is there any other big event that to you could potentially be one of those sleeper events,
Yeah.
other than just heat and drought?
Right. Like any other different factor that might.
Yeah. And so you and me often look at things through a weather lens, right? But it's why does that weather matter? And that's where I think the interconnectedness comes really to the forefront here is how does that play out in our water? How does that play out in our food? How does that play out in how we plant, where we plant, how we organize things? And so all of this is really important. So this is where that extra heat in the system comes out through some of our changing weather on the bigs and the extremes, but it's also playing out in everyday ways. And one of the things I think that's really big in Ohio, and sometimes not understood completely, is how it's shifting seasons, right? So nothing,
Yes.
as we're saying, everything's connected. So if you get more heat, think of it as a bubble, right? You've got more heat in that summer season, it's pushing spring earlier, it's pushing fall later, and it's squashing some of our winter. And I know a lot of people like that idea.
Yeah, right. But we need it.
But our systems are set up that way.
Yeah.
Specific crops are set up for a specific type of chill during the winter to give the land time to recover. It also, the types of pests that we see, they are set up to a specific kind of climate. So as things warm, we're seeing new ones come in. They are getting into our farming in ways that we weren't used to. Also, how we're seeing mosquitoes later in the year outside of even farming. I'm in New Jersey, a little bit different than Ohio, but not too much in some ways. And just 2 years ago for Halloween, walking my kids around, and we had mosquitoes biting us. And I was just like, this is not normal. And how that plays out in allergies. And again, this is the same idea of extremes, but also every day. Some people with allergy issues, it is incredibly extreme. And as we're extending these allergy seasons, by extending these seasons, it's really playing into people's ways of life. But then even people who didn't have allergies, with new allergens creeping north in a warmer climate, extending the season, it's starting to become a problem for people who it wasn't before. So this is how the extended season, I think, really is a big deal. It plays into our energy bills. It plays into the crops that we plant. And when we harvest them, it plays into our lifestyle events that I don't think people always connect to. And so the types of things that we love to do during certain seasons, we know football and certain sports are really big, and it starts in the summer, right? And if you've got too much heat, having to rethink practices, having to rethink kids going to camps. These things may sound small, but they really affect people's lives and they're building up. And with our shifting of seasons, that's what we're seeing.
I think that that is so interesting, the shift of season, especially in Ohio, where we are a 4-season state, or we used to be, or we have been. But McCall and I, we started this podcast 4 years ago. And I'd say in year one, we actually had a scientist who specialized in insects.
Yes.
And they were already talking about the fact that a lot of our bugs were creeping further north, to the point where they were almost like moving out of Ohio and up into Michigan. And then we've also had our agricultural experts who have spoken about crops here in Ohio. And again, this is like 4 years ago at this point. And then another thing that I think here in the Miami Valley that we've even noticed over the past several years is, as we have that increased frequency of 90-degree days, we've had an increase in our dew points.
Yes.
Where typically we may just have a 90-degree day with the dew point in the 50s, like that's fine. But we're seeing that the heat index is able to go over 100, and we have people that work outside, we have sports. So yeah, that's like one of those daily, being able to work outdoors and not be injured by heat. And then also your children being able to play outside and that kind of thing. That is maybe something that gets overlooked, but that is also an impact from our warming climate.
And I think, Bernadette, you really hit it the nail on the head. There's 3 things that stuck out from what you were saying: food, water, and finance.
Yeah.
Take everything else away. Those are most likely the top 3 most important things to a human, right? Having food, having water, and then having money to survive. And when you're removing the food because of the changing seasons, and maybe you're in an area that's going through a drought, that's stressful. And then it's also stressful on your wallet. And sometimes it's not a direct tie back to climate change, but it sounds like it really does have a very serious connection.
It does. And I'd like to add one more to that too. And then I'm going to get into the finance for a minute, but health.
Yeah.
These things we were talking about, we may not have categorized it that way, but health is, everyone listening to this knows that when there's a health issue for you or your family, it overwhelms everything. Just like finances, just like food, just like water. I mean, life stops around those events. And this is changing our health in some fundamental ways. We already talked about the bigs, the extremes, the more huge weather events. But then the everyday things, as we were just talking about too, that it's playing into with allergies and bugs, and how we have to set up our systems around this, meaning when we have our camps, when we do things, when people who work on farms, not just the crops themselves, but the farm workers, when they go out to get the food, when it is harvest time, and are we having the things align at the right time? Is it if the heat's coming at the wrong time of year, or if the heavy rains are coming at the wrong time of year? Things are just out of whack in these ways. And so health is a huge part of this. And I'll add one more to that: air quality in general, because one thing that is so underestimated with our changing climate is air quality. And for people to understand, there's 2 ways I'm going to look at this here. One is what we call PM 2.5, and it's these really small particles. But they get into your lungs, they hurt your breathing, and they can hurt your heart. And this is where it's connected to out west, right? We've already seen where this explosion of Western wildfires carries that bad air quality with that PM 2.5 to Ohio and points farther east. And it is already affecting our air quality in those days. And an extra to that really is our Clean Air Act really cleaned up our air in a lot of ways. But we're seeing this spike of PM 2.5 amounts countering some of the advancements we've made. And then the second piece is what we call ground level ozone. And that's really like this noxious combination that pops up and is created when we have heat, when we have sunlight, and when we put extra pollutants into our atmosphere that come from our factories, from tailpipes of non-EV vehicles. And so that combination, when we get these domes of hot air that sit around for a while, create really bad air quality. And so we're having to change lifestyles around that too. So air quality is a big one with that too.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's underlooked. I'm going to bring up one more point real quickly. And it's one of the things that when we talk about our changing climate, sometimes we get the argument that, oh, it's a cycle. And so this has happened before, it's a cycle. How would you combat that train of thought, or, maybe explain it to someone who just wants to say it's only cyclical?
Well, I mean, we do have changes naturally in our climates. what we're seeing right now is, I'll bring it down to a couple of key points. One, the greenhouse effect. We understand the greenhouse effect. That is the combination of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. This is science that goes back to the 1800s, well understood. We would not have life on this planet without the greenhouse effect. It keeps that blanket around our atmosphere that keeps our planet at a livable temperature. So the greenhouse effect, well understood. So we know what those greenhouse gases are, and two of the key ones are methane and carbon dioxide. So let's take a look. We can measure right now that there is more methane and more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. We know where it's coming from, primarily from the burning of fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and gas. Like, there's a specific type of isotope that you can look at, and we're seeing it, we're measuring it increasing. And we know, going back to the greenhouse effect, what those greenhouse gases do. They trap heat. So when you trap heat, you add more heat, but it also shakes things up. So we see more heat, but then it shakes up the system, and that plays out in the ways that we're describing right now.
Yeah, it's very basic and elementary when you think about it. Go back to grade school, learning about greenhouse gases, and then looking ahead, as you said, there is science, there is data that's showing that increased CO2 and methane gas, that or carbon dioxide, that is causing issues for us now. And if we don't get that under control, it's going to just get exponentially worse. And at some point, there is no going back, right? So we have to try and stop it. And then, I mean, what do you say? Is there any going back at this point?
So that's a really interesting question, because I think with this topic, you have to look at it slightly different. So I'm gonna rephrase this just a little bit here. So one of the things that is also misunderstood with our greenhouse gases is the lifespan of them. Carbon dioxide is the one you hear about most because it lives the longest. So as we put it into our atmosphere, it does have half-lives. That's what happens. Take us back to our chemistry classes, right? But it lives in our atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years in some form. So what we're putting out today locks in future warming. Methane is much stronger in a shorter time frame. So it doesn't last as long, but it's much more powerful than carbon dioxide. So you hear a lot about carbon dioxide for that reason. So those are the two key ones that I'm going to talk about. And with that, this is why I want to rephrase that a little bit, because we've already locked in some future amount of warming. I mean, that has happened, and we're seeing it already play out. It's already supercharging storms. It's already changing and damaging our health. It's already hurting our economy. This is already happening. But if we don't get this under control, the future warming is going to escalate and accelerate. And that's where we all come in, because that is not determined yet. So we're at a point where globally we've risen to about 1.2 degrees Celsius. Remember, the globe talks in Celsius. So what we're looking at is this global goal of a 1.5 to a 2, and we're at 1.2 already. If you continue on the path without making changes, we could be going to a 4 or a 5. And look at all the changes we're seeing already with a 1.2. So that's a huge difference. If we can keep it in that 1-ish zone or to 2, we can adapt and we can deal with the changes that we had. These things we were talking about with how we update infrastructure, how we plan for things, we can handle that. I mean, there's a certain amount of warming, it's locked in there and changing things already, but we can handle it if we can get our emissions from all of this extra pollution under control. If we don't, it's going to a level that really we don't want to see. But I don't want to just scare people. I mean, it is serious. It's incredibly serious. And it already is so damaging for some people that have lost their lives from this. So there's that reality. But I also want people to understand that path is not written yet. We are writing that path. And this is where we've got these solutions that are working. And we know what they are. And I'll tell you in just a moment a few of them, but the warming's happening faster. And we need to change that course. We need to escalate and accelerate those solutions so that we can curb that warming trend that we're seeing. And in the United States, our biggest form of emissions and pollution is coming from transportation. Our second is from the energy sector, and it's a very close second. So those are two humongous ones. Our agriculture sector plays in, but our two biggest ones are transportation and energy. But we already have very advanced technology around electric vehicles
Mhm.
and cleaner forms of energy.
Mhm.
These
Yeah.
exist, these are already out there. And what's so fascinating for Ohio is playing a major role going forward in this, because there are a lot of proposals right now of bringing back a lot of manufacturing in cleaner ways. Ohio plants that used to produce cars that closed down are bringing back production of electric vehicles.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's new battery plants coming in across the United States. And Ohio is likely getting one of those huge. So it's going to bring more jobs. And this is just going to advance everything for us. So this is where there's a lot of excitement and opportunity around. There are so many more jobs in the clean energy sector right now than there are in the fossil fuel energy sector right now. And that doesn't mean we want to leave people behind, because we don't. And I hope people can hear this, because it's hard sometimes if that's part of your life, but you didn't do anything wrong. I mean, that was your
Right.
job, that was your path. But there's this transition, because we know more now, and there's a transition underway, and we just really need to accelerate and supersize that transition so that we can bend that warming curve.
I mean, I think that's great. I think that that's a wonderful way to look at it
Mhm.
as opportunity. And like you said, the average person didn't do anything wrong. Like, this was their job that they probably
Yeah.
had access to, and
They needed that car to
needed-
drive to
yeah.
work.
exactly. So I like that. It's nobody's fault per se, but as a whole, we can, like you said, rewrite that future for us and have a more positive outcome, so that it can positively impact more and more of us over, the next hundreds of years.
Well, Bernadette, we could have talked to you for 30 more
I know,
minutes.
forever.
And I'm sure
We'll do
we're
it
gonna,
again sometime.
We
yes,
will.
absolutely. I'm sure when we have some type of big weather event and we can tie it to climate, we would love to have you back on as a guest.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us.
And thank you for having me.
It's funny because when Bernadette had talked about how she'd also been a broadcast meteorologist for decades, when you listen to her, you kind of understand. She just was able to break down some really complex ideas. I think it made it very easy to understand.
And I'm so excited about all of the projects and things that are coming down the line with Climate Central and Climate Matters, and all of the new information and data that they're going to be able to provide to us.
Yeah.
And going to what you're saying about Bernadette being someone from media and then getting into this position,
Right.
she really knows how to take that information and make it digestible, I think, for not only us as media partners, but for the people that we're talking to.
Exactly. So thanks so much for joining us on Cloudy with a Chance of Podcast this week. Remember, you could go back and watch some of our past episodes, our past seasons, and to continue to listen, don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, as well as Spotify, and always on WHIO.com. We have all of our videos and all of our past episodes there as well. We'll see you next time.